Hi there, this is Laura Whitmore with the Women's International Music Network. I'm usually here presenting live music to you on the third Thursday of the month, but this time we have a special broadcast. We'll be chatting about an amazing woman and an amazing book, the wonderful memoir, Permanent Damage, Memoirs of an Outrageous Girl about Mercy Fontenot, the GTO's Miss Mercy. And we'll be chatting with the author or co-author, as it may be, Lyndsey Parker. So I think we'll bring Lyndsey in, and she and I are just going to have a chat about this amazing story. Hey there, Lyndsey.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, I'm psyched to talk to you. So, Lyndsey, in case you don't know who Lyndsey Parker is, she's the host of SiriusXM's Volume West and also music editor for Yahoo Entertainment. And as I mentioned, the person who ushered into the world this amazing story.
Product placement. Sorry.
Yes, that's it. That's it. Permanent Damage, Memoirs of an Outrageous Girl. So I think my first question is, how did you meet and get to know Miss Mercy, and what inspired you to dig into this story?
Well, I think a lot of people know the GTOs because of Pamela DeBar, who actually wrote the afterword to this book. She was in the GTOs, which was like, I think they were like the Spice Girls of their time. They were a girl group that a lot of people think were masterminded or put together by Frank Zappa, but he was not a Kim Fowley or Svengali. He basically just realized they had this magic to them and put them together and said, write songs and I'll put you in the studio. And they were the yin and yang in the group were Miss Mercy and Miss Pamela. Pamela was very sexually driven. She was this very coquettish, sexy girl in like skimpy mini dresses and stuff. And then like the freak of the group was Mercy Fontenot, or Miss Mercy, who actually at that time was kind of the most famous one. She was the one that was in Rolling Stone all the time. She was the scandalous one. She was actually, I think, the one the girls liked the best, the female fans liked the best, because they related to her the most and kind of looked up to the fact that she didn't maybe seem like the typical groupie, what people think a groupie is, and she was having all these adventures. So Pamela and Mercy, although the GTOs were very short-lived, it was like a year in both their lives, they stayed best friends right through to the end, which Pamela's very touching afterward talks about. And Pamela's known for having these amazing parties with all sorts of. Mercy was just always there, and she was always like in 5 different leopard prints and 10 belts and red hair. Just wherever she went, she got all dolled up and looked like a freak. Pamela used to call her the first time she met her, she called her a threat to normalcy, the human facsimile. Mercy was an unusual person. Mercy actually in the book theorizes that she was part alien, because Mercy has Rh negative blood, and there are some people that believe that people with Rh negative blood are descended from outer space. It would explain a lot if that were the case. I'm not saying that theory's wrong, but I'm not saying it's not wrong. But Mercy was very passionate about everything. She was passionate about her friends, the music she loved, the movies she loved. She was really, really, like, when she loved something, she loved it wholeheartedly. And she'd see me on TV. I used to do a segment on the news, and she just like yelled at me across the room, like, hey, I see you on the news. I think you're great. And so we became friendly, and we were friends for maybe about 4 years. During that time, I heard a lot of her tales. And more than once, I was not the only person who'd ever said to her, like, you need to write a book. Pamela has her book. Your story's very different. Where's your book? And one night I volunteered to do it with her, not knowing what I was getting myself into. And she took me up on it. And she was very serious about it. Like, once she decided to do it, like I said, when she got invested in something, she got invested in it all the way. She really wanted to work on it, and it really became a passion project of hers. And, sadly it came out next month, July 27th will be the anniversary of her death. So she did not live to see it come out, but she lived knowing it was coming out. So she knew. She actually signed the contract for the book a week before she died. So I take solace in knowing that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Reading the book, her life was so crazy and interesting and out there. I was wondering, like, what was she like as a person when you met her? Like, what did you think?
I mean, she was a little. It's interesting because Pamela said that when she met her, she was intimidated by her. I wouldn't say I was intimidated, but I thought she was a freak. I thought she was a badass. I kind of got used to it, and it would be funny because a lot of times when we worked on the book together, which is basically, this book is just it's her words I wouldn't say she dictated to me. That would make it seem like it was organized and there was a process to it. But our conversations, which I then transcribed, hours of conversations, thousands of pages, and just sort of parsed and took her words and fashion in some kind of semi-linear narrative. But we would meet at Starbucks. Sometimes we'd go out for dinner, and she'd always be looking like how she always does. And I kind of got used to it. And I'd be at Starbucks with her, and people would be like staring. And I'd be like, what? Why is everyone staring? Oh, that's why.
Oh, right.
To RuPaul's Drag Con a couple times, and everyone thought she was like dressed. If you've been to the Drag Con convention, everyone dresses up. A lot of people wore sequins and platforms and feathers and boas, and people thought like they'd be like, "Oh, you're so cool!" Like they thought she was some grandma who was dressed up for that day. She always looked like that. She looked like that to go to Trader Joe's. I thought she was, and I still think this, that she was kind of tough and kind of brittle. And a little bit of a tough nut to crack, but you could tell she had a heart of gold. I just love the fact that she was so like she was still so in it. Like when I met her, she was in her late 60s. She was still dressing like a freak, not giving an F what other people thought. She was still very into music, new music too. She didn't just like listen to music from the 60s or 70s. She was very into new music. She still went out to shows all the time. Her Facebook wall was basically a shrine to whatever music or TV show. Like she got really into Empire. She got really into like Pose. She got really into Legendary. She got like really into shows, and she was just very passionate about stuff. I found that inspiring. I'd like to be like her when I grow up in some ways, not in all ways, but I would like to still be that excited about things, everything.
Yeah. It's interesting. I watched another interview that you did. Oh no, I'm hearing an echo. Uh-oh. And you talked about her, like today she would be considered an influencer. And I was wondering, like, what was her influence, when she was out in the scene? Like, I think she was an influencer back then, and maybe in a different way than we look at it today. But
I mean, she was definitely a fashion influencer. I mean, it's funny because she has said repeatedly, and I'm not saying she's not right, that she's convinced she influenced Alice Cooper's eye makeup. She's convinced that she influenced Courtney Love. She's convinced she influenced Kiss, which that's actually true. It's actually true of Alice too. She definitely was an influence. Alice Cooper and the GTOs were friends. They lived in the same hotel. They were on the same record label, Frank Zappa's label. But the whole like kind of steampunk thing, like she really originated that. Like the eye makeup, the layers and layers of clothes, which the reason she wore all those clothes is because she was homeless or not living at home, running away from home all the time. So she pretty much wore everything at once. She also was a big speed freak. So she like wore a lot of, when you're on speed, she just kept like layering clothes on top of each other, layering makeup on top of each other. Her bracelets and her belts were actually they had a practical purpose. So she could tie off. She did a lot of drugs.
Oh man.
What sex was to Pamela's book, I'm with the band. Her, meaning that the craziest and most talked about stories that people talked about from that book were who, she was with Mick Jagger or whatever. Mercy's craziest stories were drugs. It was drugs, and rock and rolls for her. She, that's why it's almost like groupie isn't quite the right word for her, because she wasn't that sexually driven. She had affairs, a marriage to Shuggy Otis. She had trysts and one night stands, but that really wasn't what drove her. But, the drugs sort of fed into the fashion, but she was like an influencer when she was. What's interesting is a lot of people probably don't even realize, they will realize if they read the book, that she had a whole like career, or if you want to call it a career, a whole like life before she came to Hollywood and ended up in the GTO. She was in the Haight-Ashbury scene, hanging out with Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and all of those people, and going to the very first Love-In, and she was on the 6th cover ever of Rolling Stone, because she was at the Golden Gate Park at the the Be-Ins and the Happenings, and she was walking around San Francisco, and they were like giving her free clothes when she walked into stores, because she was a trendsetter. The whole like the layered look. Alice Cooper said Mercy invented layering. I like that. I want to use that quote. The layered look, the makeup, definitely. I do see it. I don't know if people like necessarily when they're putting on the clothes or whatever, they're thinking, oh, this is a tribute to Mercy. But I do feel her fashion influence got. And like I said, in Rolling Stone and magazines like that, they wrote about her more than they wrote about the others, because she was the weirdest one. And that's why she and Christine were like the last two to get in the group, I believe. Either her and Cinderella, her and Cinderella were the last two to get in the group. And it was because she went to visit the log cabin, Frank Zappa's house, and Frank Zappa took a look at her and said, "This is the element we need to make the GT. You know, we need the weird one. You know, just like how all the girl bands or boy bands have the jock, the whatever. She was the weird one, and I think that was her appeal to the press, and I think it was her appeal, as I said again, to her female fans. And she would be an influencer now. It was groupie's not quite the right word.
Yeah, interesting. You know, when I oh man, I wish the echo wasn't here.
I don't hear you. Sound fine.
You don't
to me.
hear it.
It's a little reverb, just rock and roll.
All right. Well, we'll keep going. When I look at her life from a modern day perspective, I think, wow, like, you know, it's kind of horrifying and ballsy and, you know, so much energy invested in finding drugs. But how was she looked at in her heyday? Like, was she like the girl everyone wanted to be there in the room, or like what, you know, what do you think people thought about her, you know,
I feel
back
was
in the day?
Yeah, I mean, all the things I already said about how she was the weird one, or how she was the one that the girls kind of looked at and said, "Oh, I could be like that. Like that's attainable, whatever." And also admired maybe the fact that she was in this group of groupies or whatever, and was in like this groupie issue of Rolling Stone, which she wasn't, you know, and I mean this in not a shady way, but was not like a conventional beauty. I actually think she was very pretty. She didn't really think she was, but you know, she was very self-conscious about her weight. She was like the heaviest one in the band at the time, and you know, some of the others in the band were like total Twiggy, you know, gazelle like very skinny girls, which was like in vogue at that time. But how she was perceived, I think she just wanted to be kind of like one of the girls, and you know, one of the guys, and so I think it was more important for her to be accepted as like not a sex pot or a desirable sex object, but just to sort of like have her music knowledge be respected. I think I've said this before. I think she would have or should have gone into A&R if other things, you know, if other things had panned out.
I think it was so interesting how she was so excited about music, and she was so excited about turning other people on to music that she thought they should know. And like how passionate she was about, oh my gosh, I have to share this with you. Like, how do you not know this music?
Well, that was another thing in terms of like the whole idea of groupie, is that there is this fallacy that like groupies go after people who are already famous. And the sole reason they go after them is because of that intoxication of fame. And it wasn't that case with her. It was sometimes, but she just was very attracted to talent. She kind of liked to get on the ground floor. She kind of liked to tell, like she was very early on Al Green. She was also very late on Arthur Lee, when Arthur Lee was kind of considered a little washed up or whatever. She just really liked to tell people like, this music's great. And she would never date or sleep with someone or whatever if she, just because they were famous. She was attracted to talent and artistry, and she just, she loved to do that. She would, I mean, if you were friends with her on Facebook, that's all she did. Like the people she was really into later in her life was Yoshiki from X Japan, Starcrawler, who became part of her story because they put her on the cover of their single, and they, you know, even played the Stories Books and Cafe live release party that we were amazingly able to have. She was very into like, I mean, her black music and soul music was mainly her thing. She was or soul music, usually by black artists, but not entirely. She did like some of the white artists she liked were Amy Winehouse. She's a big fan of Macklemore. She liked Nathaniel Rateliff. She was very into him because he was like on the reboot of Stax Records, and Stax Records was her favorite label. But she loved Bruno Mars, like The Weeknd. She was super into Kendrick Lamar. She loved Kendrick Lamar very much. She was very into R. Kelly, problematicness aside. She liked, she was very into his whole trapped in the closet thing because it reminded her of her favorite album of all time, which is David Porter's The Victim of a Joke. What else did she like? She really liked Gary Clark Jr. She was very into soul music and new music, like I say. And she was very into all the RuPaul's Drag Race stuff. She was very into like the whole gender bending thing. She had dated one of the Cockettes when she was in San Francisco. She understood like the lineage and the history of drag. So that was another thing she was into. I went to a lot of drag events with her. So like, and she evangelized it all. She did not ever want to make it so people couldn't post on her Facebook for some reason, because there is a way to do that. But she'd get mad if people did, because it would like ruin the order. She saw her Facebook wall as like a narrative of whatever she was listening to or watching. She really considered herself a tastemaker. And I think that was a big thing she wanted to have in this book, was her, she never wanted to really be a musician herself. She obviously dabbled in that with the GTOs, but she really just kind of wanted to, champion people she liked. Even on the GTOs record, she did Shock Treatment, the song she wrote. She was supposed to do most of the vocals for that. And then when a almost then unknown Rod Stewart wandered into the studio and she heard him sing, she put him on the track instead, had him do most of the singing. So that was how she was.
Yeah. Interesting. I believe in the book you mentioned that she didn't really think of herself as a feminist, but she really was so pioneering as a woman in those times to be everywhere and be so influential and be putting yourself in all these, places where she could have an impact.
I think she considered herself a feminist later. We have to talk about the generational thing. This is a woman who, was in the 60s, this was the 60s, and she also was 71 when she died. And there was, so she was a boomer basically. And there was this idea then that being a feminist that means you don't like men, which is kind of in retrospect, phobic way to look at it, because it's sort of like being like, oh, but I like men, well, what if you don't like men? That's fine. And she also was bisexual, I want to point out. But there was a stigma to what the word feminist meant then, that meant that you hated men. And obviously that was absolutely not the case with her or any of the GTOs. And so I don't think at that time, the whatever wave it was, I guess second wave feminism, that definition of that they thought it was burning your bra or whatever, like they didn't subscribe to that. But I had conversations with Mercy about that, where one time she was saying she didn't necessarily consider herself a feminist, but then she started to say all these things that were feminist, like, oh, but I believe women should be able to do whatever they want. I believe women should be like, respected. I believe women should have complete autonomy over their bodies. I believe women should get equal pay for equal work, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, everything you just said was feminist. And she's like, oh, I guess I'm feminist then. She wasn't real big into labels, which I get, or identity politics, which I get is another kind of generation thing. It's very different from millennials or Gen Z and she just didn't really think about that much. And she also grew up in this bubble of San Francisco and also Hollywood, where it obviously didn't reflect a lot of what was going on in the rest of the country. But, like I said, she was having affairs with women. She was having affairs with the Cockettes. A couple of her boyfriends were actually gay. One of her boyfriends was the famous glam rocker Joe Bryant. I don't think she really thought about those things. She just kind of went about her life and did whatever she wanted. And it was only in retrospect where she's like, oh, I guess that's what feminism is. So, it's definitely a generational thing. And the idea of what people it was a dirty word in 1969 or whatever, it was like, if you were considered a feminist, you were considered humorless or man hating or just not fun. And it was just not, unfortunately at that time, maybe a word that was just not something people wanted to embrace the way they do now. But she did embrace it in her later years.
Yeah. It's interesting too. When she obviously talks a lot about her drug use in the book.
You think?
You think she seems so casual about it. It's no big deal. What was her view on it later? What was her whole outlook on that? It was.
It's almost like every memory she had was had a drug that went with it. When I was doing this, I was on heroin. When I was doing this, I was on speed, which was her drug of choice. When I was doing this, I was on crack, which was something she got addicted to in her 40s, in the 90s. What was the question? What was her how she looked back on it?
Yeah, maybe how she looked back on it, or she did seem just so she's almost proud of it. It's
I don't know if she was proud of it. She just didn't really, as she says in the book, shame isn't something I do. She wasn't one to really live with regrets. She was sober. I want to point out, she was sober for more than the last 20 years of her life. She died at 71, and she definitely was sober by the time she was 50. And she was very hard, she was hard-headed and strong-minded about everything. Like I said, when she put her mind to something, she stick with it. So she never relapsed once. When she got clean, and that was it. There was no actual, like, even like harrowing story about how she got clean. It was just, she just decided one day. I don't think she had regrets other than the fact of how it affected her relationship with her son. She did definitely regret that. But other than that, I don't think she just wasn't ashamed of it. It was just kind of like, and she also didn't ever consider herself a victim. She, there are, a lot of people, and of course, there's lots of schools of thought about addiction being a disease. I 100% believe that. But she just very much took ownership for any mistakes she made. She'd be like, hey, no one forced me to take those drugs. No one, I knew what I was getting into. I knew it was risky. I knew it was dangerous, especially like some of the situations she put herself in when trying to cop drugs. And she's like, and I have no one to blame but myself. She never wanted to play the victim about anything. So I don't know if the word is proud of it. She's just like very transparent and definitely not ashamed of it. I don't think she's like trying to in any way glamorize drugs. And I don't think the book does at all because, all of the bad things that happened to her, along with the fun things that happened to her were all related to drugs. It was just like, she just basically did a lot of drugs and had some fun. And when she got tired of it and it stopped being fun, she eventually stopped. But that was just how she was. She wasn't embarrassed about anything. She was very fearless. I did say in the book, I think she was born without a fear mechanism.
Yeah.
And being born without a fear mechanism has two sides to it. If you have no fear mechanism, you'll get into some pretty cool adventures because you're not shy. You'll take chances. You'll do something like, oh, I really like Stax music, so I want to check out what's going on in Memphis. And you'll hitchhike to Memphis, land in the parking lot of Stax Records with no plan other than just go in the parking lot, see what happens. See some guys come out, be like, hey, introduce yourself. Before you know it, they're whisking you away to a session with a new rising soul star named Al Green, who you will eventually sleep with. And you'll have all these adventures, all of the cool things. Like the fact that she was like, I live in Hollywood. When I've seen a movie being shot on the street, which is not an uncommon occurrence here, I've never thought to like walk up and be like, hi, I'd like to be in this movie. And if I did, they would probably be like, no. When she did it, they gave her a role. Like they put her in this weird, bizarre horror movie. So she, having no fear mechanism, got her into some awesome adventures and stories because she was not shy to just take a chance in things. It also got her some really bad situations where had she had been maybe not on drugs at the time and thinking properly and exercising that fear mechanism, she would have been like, this is a bad idea. I should not do this. So she took the good with the bad. She definitely wasn't proud that she did drugs, and she wasn't certainly proud of how it, like I said, affected her relationship with her son. But I did not get the impression she wasn't embarrassed. She was not embarrassed by anything she did. Like the best story is that when she encountered Rod Stewart on the street when she was homeless and a crack addict, years later after when he had appeared on her song Shock Treatment, when they had, when he hadn't been famous, and now his life has gone this way and her life, to the highest it could go. And she's literally living in the gutter some nights. She was literally living in a box, like on the street at some points in her life, rummaging in the Jack in Box dumpster for food. She wasn't embarrassed. She's like, hey, Rod. She wasn't like, oh my God, he can't see me like this. And when he didn't acknowledge her, and to this day, like she thinks he recognized her and just didn't want to be bothered. I have a feeling maybe he didn't recognize her. I don't know. But she was not, instead of, the normal human response, which would have been to be like, oh, I'm really embarrassed that like he's seen me, at the lowest of the low when he's become this millionaire rock star. She like turned it back on him and was kind of like, basically he should be embarrassed for being such a snob and not, saying hello to an old friend because he thinks he's too good for me. That's how she thought. So that's a long answer, but she just didn't get embarrassed about anything. She just didn't.
Yeah, it's interesting too, though, because I will say it seemed like she would get things going, like the GTOs, for example, and the drugs kind of ruined it for her.
Yeah, she ruined things. She does, she doesn't regret a lot of things. I don't know how contrite she really was about things, but she was sorry for that. Yeah, Frank Zappa, who, as I said, put the GTOs together and had, was not really a Svengali about it. I was actually very surprised to find out that he pretty much said, each of you write 2 songs and come back. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
he didn't have songs for them. I mean, when you listen to the album, it's like, okay, I guess it makes sense that wasn't superstar songwriters writing that album. It's very avant-garde, but he was very straight and narrow. People, you know, people who know anything about Frank Zappa know this, but people who aren't familiar with Frank Zappa, they probably thought he did a lot of drugs or whatever, because he just seems like such a psychedelic musician. But he was very, very sober and very anti-drug. So when he got wind that some of the GTOs were doing drugs, which happened when Mercy and Christine got busted up driving through Laurel Canyon, they got busted for heroin. That ended things for the GTOs effectively, you know, and they kind of kept it going for a little bit to, you know, do the promo for their album that was about to come out. But he basically stopped paying them. They were on his payroll. He was paying their rent at the Landmark Motel. That ended, and that ended the GTOs. So, and that was, it was because of her, but she, you know, she does regret that, you know, but who knows how long something like that could have sustained itself anyway. I think that was probably just meant to be a blip in time.
Yeah, maybe. You know, she also talks about, you know, being assaulted, and I thought there was one part that was really interesting where it talks about, you know, if it was going to be someone, I'd rather be me because I can handle it. I can take it. You know, if these
like a
people
Joan
were
of Arc
going to,
mentality.
if there were going to be predators, like I'm okay to be the victim because it saved somebody else from having.
Yeah, she had some pretty interesting ideas about consent that I wondered how they would be received today, because I think people see things, you know, things about consent in a more black and white way now, which is good. But, you know, it was, like I said, a different time then. But she definitely took responsibility. She would always be like, look, I'm paraphrasing her, but she would always, she got raped at least, sorry, trigger warning. She got raped at least 4 times that she remembered. And they're in the book with the trigger warning. And they were always in situations usually that involved drugs, and a couple of which that involved her hitchhiking, a couple of which involved her like going off with someone she didn't know because that person had told her he had drugs or whatever. And in each case, she wasn't like, I asked for this. She definitely didn't think she asked for it or that she deserved it. But she did take some responsibility, being, look, I put myself in a risky situation, probably shouldn't have hitchhiked, probably shouldn't have gone in that guy's car, probably shouldn't have gone back to that guy's hotel or to his house. And I do think she compartmentalize a lot of stuff. It's bizarre to me that when one of these assaults happened, when the guy let her and her friend go, it had happened when they were en route to go dancing at a club, and they hitchhiked with this guy. And after he did what he did and let him go, they still went to the club. They like hitchhiked another car and went to the club. But I was like, how could you do that? And she's like, well, what would going home solve anything? Like, I might as well just go out and still have a good time and try to dance my cares away. Definitely some interesting things about sort of her taking responsibility for the bad things like that happened to her, and the idea of consent. It's kind of more of an antiquated take on things. But again, she did not like to play the victim at all. Anything. She never wanted anyone to be like, oh, I feel so bad for you that these bad things happened to you, whatever these bad things were. I think she actually probably took a little bit of comfort in being like, well, I got to take some responsibility for this bad thing that happened to me. And she did, you know, have some issues with, I don't know, just in general, like she did not like being perceived with any kind of sympathy. I think the last thing she would want would be for anyone to read this book, which obviously we're talking about some dark stuff. I do want to point out there's some fun stuff in the book too.
Yes.
But I think the last thing she would want to do is, the last thing she would absolutely want to do is have anyone read the book and be like, oh, she had a sad life or a dark life, or I feel bad for her, or poor Mercy. That would be the last thing she would want.
Well, I mean, I think I look at it like these negative things that happened, you know, maybe they were just like payment for all the great things, because I'm sure like all the fun times and the enjoyment she had and being there at these really crucial moments in history were really exciting for her. And if she felt like the only way that she could be there is to, you know, take some risks and pay her dues or whatever it is she'd have to deal with to do that, she seemed to be willing to put herself out there.
Well, it's like I said, you know, the lack of fear, and in times that was coupled with a lack of common sense, you know. It was the lack of fear got her into some really good situations, some fun situations where she got to like meet and hang out with Teenie Hodges and Al Green, where she got to like, you know, hang out with all these other celebrities, where she got to meet Shuggie Otis, who ended up being her husband, where she got to like jump out of a cake at Alice Cooper's, you know, coming out record release party, all these cool things. She got herself in, she was in film. She got herself into she was in the roller derby. She was in some fun situations because she was not afraid to just go after fun things and throw herself into situations, but she got herself into some bad situations as well. And she definitely, she had that Joan of Arc. It was a weird thing where she basically said like, well, when bad things happened to her, including these assaults that, you know, are in the book in some pretty harrowing detail, she'd be like, well, better it happened to me than someone else. Like she basically be like, I've known people who've had these bad things happen to them and they just never recover from it. And she's like, and I can. So better happen to me than someone who's more fragile. I think she was more fragile and she let on. I definitely know that from spending so much time with her, but she was the way she processed stuff was to put up this kind of brittle facade underneath which she was actually a very soft-hearted person. She was actually a very sweet person. And that was actually something that was a concern of mine when taking, like I said, these are her words, and she speaks in a certain way. And people who know her have told me, and herself before she died told me I really got her voice right. But I was a little worried that she would not be empathetic enough, that people would just be like, this chick's crazy, or whatever, or this chick doesn't seem like, her lack of regret or her insistence, she has a lack of regret for things, would make people not root for her. I hope people did. And the book does end on a very positive note because, as I mentioned, she was sober for many, many years. And she really enjoyed her life, you know, up until the end. Up until the end, she was, I mean, that was crazy to me, is when I was asked her one time, what was your favorite time in your life? And I'll just rattle off what some of the answers could have been. Like, being in the Haight-Ashbury scene in the 60s, seeing 13th floor elevators at the Fillmore and hanging out with Jimi Hendrix and all this. The GTOs, when you were friends with the Rolling Stones and Graham Parsons and all that. Your boyfriend was Joe Bryant, and you were had all these great adventures, like recording with Jeff Beck and Lowell George and Rod Stewart. Afterwards, when she was hanging out in the punk scene, that's crazy. She says Zelig. She did those things, and then she was a really big part of the punk scene. She was like hanging out with X, and she was like doing hair for the Rockettes and the Gears, and she was very in that scene. She was at the Mask when it was new. Like, those are just some of the things she could have said. And she's like, she gave it some thought. Like, she was really thinking about it. And then she was like, I guess now. And she was like, a woman in her late 60s who was living in a very small, humble apartment in downtown LA. And she had a job at Goodwill Industries where she was an auction curator, but, it wasn't a super glamorous or high paid job. And she was really happy. She was really happy with her life, So it's not all like, she had some really dark shit happen to her, but she definitely was not someone who sat around being like, woe is me. And she also wasn't someone who sat around being like, oh, if I hadn't done all these drugs or made some of the mistakes in my life, maybe I would be more famous. Maybe I would be a rock star myself, whatever. I don't think being famous was necessarily her, or even being wealthy or anything like that was ever her goal. But I do think it was very important for her that she wanted to be respected and remembered. When she died, and there were things like, well, besides this book coming out, that was the agenda. That was what was driving her to get her story out before she died. But when she died and there was an obituary the next day in Rolling Stone, I was like, oh my God, she would have loved this. When they had her in the in memoriam section for the Grammys, or when there were all the press that's come out for the book in The Guardian and Mojo, I said, oh, she would have loved it so much. That's the sad thing, is that she's not doing this interview with me. But I think that, the book has done what it was supposed to do, which is just like, she wanted to be remembered, as someone who was a rock and roll historical figure. So, because she is one of those kind of like lost cases. A lot of people honestly thought she died a long time ago. Like when I would say I was writing a book with Mercy, they'd be like, "Oh, she's still alive. That's great." People thought if people had back in 1969 had been trying to figure out, very sadly, there's only 2 GTOs left. And until Mercy was, there were 3 when Mercy was still alive. There were 7 altogether. And the other 4 died all very, very young. If someone had been morbidly, doing some kind of poll or whatever, a pool, what they call it, which do you think is the GTO who's going to be a member of the 27 club? And, everyone would have said Mercy. Everyone, because of all the drugs and all the reckless living she did. So the fact that she made it to 71 and had this pretty stable life at the end is actually very, very inspiring. She always said she didn't want to die young. She didn't want to be a member of the 27 club. She did not want to die young and leave a good looking corpse. She wanted to stick around because she thought she had a place as like this musical influencer. So she made it to a pretty, considering everything she did, the fact she made it to 71 and got a book out is pretty crazy.
That's pretty awesome. I will say, I don't want to give it away, but I thought that the end of the book was really poignant and lovely. And I do think it was a nice way to bring things around. So yeah, you guys need to read it.
Well,
I just want to ask you,
she was expecting to be, it's written as if it ends with her assuming she's going to beat the illness, cancer, which unfortunately she had beat it before. She was someone who just, somehow, I was amazed by the fact that she was still like, how are you still alive? So I actually thought she was going to beat it again. I completely wrote it with the assumption that she was going to beat it again.
Yeah. I have one more question for you. I want to know, how did doing this project influence you?
How did it influence me? That's a good question. Well, we all, I'm obviously a music journalist, and we all have our different areas of expertise, what we're good at writing about. There's some people that are really good music critics. There are some people who are really good, like think piece writers, like Ann Powers or Annie Zaleski. There's people that are really good hard news reporters who, can get that breaking news. And there's also people who are really good, like humor writers, et cetera, et cetera. And over the years, I've looked, we can't all be good at, I can do those things, but what I am good at, the one thing I can be like, I'm good at is I'm good at interviewing people. This book is basically like a 200 and something page interview. And it's based on interviews. It's like, what I'm good at is telling other people's stories, getting them to talk to me, tell me some interesting stuff, and then writing a piece about it where I take all that, put it into some kind of context, put it into some kind of narrative, and tell their story. So, I already kind of knew I was good at that, but getting Mercy, who, it was not easy to get her to remember things. It was not easy to get her to like put all of these hours. I at least talked to her for 60 hours over the course of 2.5 years to get it all together. So I learned that I'm good at that. And I'm already like, who's the next person?
There you go.
I have a couple people in mind. I won't say because I haven't actually said to them, but I'm like, I have like 2 or 3 all women, all female music artists that I would like to be like, now that I have this book as kind of a calling card, is me to go like, I know you have a good story. I've frequently in my life said, why hasn't this person written a book yet? Which was why I wanted Mercy to do a book. Let me do this for you, because I think, I'm good at telling other people's stories or getting them to tell their stories. So I would like to do more of that, either doing what I did in this case, which is interviewing someone and having them dictate their story to me and then sort of making sense of it, or writing biographies of other people. I think, it just made me realize like, this is what I do best, and, there are other areas of music journalism that I'm not as good at, and that's fine, but I know what I'm good at. And the fact that I got Mercy to tell her story to me, she really trusted me. I captured her voice well. I managed to make sense out of, very non-linear conversations. I'd be talking to her and she'd be like talking about something that happened at 67. And then she'd start talking about something else. And I'd be like, wait, what year is that? And she'd be like, well, in 92. I'm like, how did we get to 92? We're just talking about 67. Why are you talking about, I had to follow it. And so, I guess I learned that I would like to do more books. I always, I think I would be good at getting other people's stories out there.
Yeah. I think you did a great job. I think it's a fascinating book, and it's, it's a moment in history and like a lifestyle that we don't really know that much about
Mm-hmm.
anymore. And I learned so much from
Thank you.
reading that, and I thought it was a wonderful. You
Thank
did a
you.
wonderful job.
I'm glad it
With
worked, because some of my
yeah.
favorite books, music books, and also rock documentaries are not about the biggest stars. As
Mhm.
exciting as it is to read or watch something about Bruce Springsteen or whoever, it's like we already know a lot about those people. And some of my favorite rock documentaries, for instance, are the Jobriath documentary, which Mercy was in. Jobriath AD. I think it's on Vimeo. You can watch it there. The Yoshiki documentary, We Are X, about X Japan. Anvil's movies, Story of Anvil. Like, I think some of the most interesting stories in pop culture are those people where after you read the book or see the movie, you're like, how did I not already know about this
Yeah.
person? Or how, this seems, I should have known about this person a long time ago. Or, how did I not know more about this person? And I'm hoping that when people read this and see all the junctures in music history she was at, all the sessions she was at, all the people she knew and influenced, that they will step back and be like, how did I not know about Miss Mercy before? And they'll tell other people about the book. And so I'm glad that you said that. Thank you.
Yeah. It was great. Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Please check out Permanent Damage, Memoirs of an Outrageous Girl. Yes, there it is. I think you can probably find it everywhere, Amazon, wherever you like to buy books.
Can I show the picture of us in here?
Yeah.
Because it's my favorite.
I got the pre-copy. I didn't get one with pictures, so I feel
okay. Well, if I could do show and tell.
Do
Just
show
a
and
couple
tell.
pictures.
Let's show some pictures.
This picture, it's probably hard to see, but that's the picture of when Mercy jumped out of Alice Cooper's cake at his coming out party in 1971 while on PCP. And that's one of my favorite stories in the book. And that was a very hard photo to hunt down. I was pretty into that. And then this is her on the cover of the 6th issue of Rolling Stone. That's her in San Francisco sitting on the grass with her first boyfriend. And then the last one, I mean, because it's probably not the best experience, but she was at this, like one of the best nights of her life, and I was with her, was when Alexa Chung, the obviously actress, influencer, fashionista, she designed a clothing line called the Muse, which was based on the GTOs. And she had this big party at the Paramore estate in the Hollywood Hills. And that's where she first actually met Arrow Dewell from Starcrawler. The girls from Haim were there. And that's a picture of her with the girls from Haim right there. And yes, I'm not doing a great job of this. And her with Arrow as well. All these pictures are from that, and her with Alexa. And it was a very big deal for her to see that these people were like, oh, you were a muse to us. And she said in the book, like, that was like her winning her Grammy, was that night. If she could have anything on her mantle, if she had a mantle, it would have been that. And that's this picture of us was taken. And this whole photo session, the photographer Brantley Gutierrez had set up a photo booth for everyone that looked like, it was all in black and white, that looked like the famous photos that Baron Wolman took of the GTOs for the Super Duper Neat Groupie issue of Rolling Stone. It had boas, and you could kind of dress up like a GTO. And that meant so much to Mercy. So it was like little things that kept happening like that in her later life, where people like Courtney Love or Arrow DeWild would talk about her, or like that meant a lot to her. So she just wanted to be known. She just wanted to be respected. And I'm glad this book came out. She knows.
I am too. Yeah.
Anyway,
she was kind of tuned into the other planes of energy. I think she must know.
She went back to her home planet.
Yeah.
Because she probably was an alien. So she went back to her. She accomplished what she needed to do. She knew the book was coming out, and she knew now she could go back to her home planet.
That's it. Well, thank you so much, Lyndsey, for joining us here. I'm Laura Whitmore with the Women's International Music Network. Please check out this fantastic book. And I'll be back on July 15th for our next She Rock Spotlight series, featuring live music from female performers, including Ajit, Stellar Addiction, and Jen and the Degenerates on July 15th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much for hosting us, Parade Magazine, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.